The scripture reading for today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, first chapter, verses 18 through 25. Now, the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be pregnant from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to divorce her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had given birth to a son, and he named him Jesus. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of the word.
Good morning. Thank you, Donna, for that reading. And man, we have certainly been to church already, haven't we? I think I'm going to start a petition that every time Alan H. Green sings, it has to come after the sermon so that we don't force our preachers to have to follow that. But my goodness, if Mary didn't know before, Mary knows now. Yeah, Mary knows. Good morning, everybody. Throughout Advent, we've explored our own relationships to fear and how the different themes of the season, hope, peace, joy, and now love, might live alongside these fears. Our goal is not to suppress them or to tuck them away, but it is to name them and therefore minimize the power that they have over us. Fear gets a bad reputation, but it also has a very important evolutionary purpose. Fear is defined as the biochemical and emotional reactions to a perceived threat, whether the danger is actual or imagined. Fear can be life-saving. It is the physical cues we get when we're alone at night and we hear a strange noise. We start sweating, we have increased heart rate, high adrenaline levels. It keeps our bodies alert and ready to act in whatever ways might be necessary to preserve our safety. But of course, the downside of fear is that our bodies are not always good at differentiating between situations that are truly threatening versus situations that may simply just be unfamiliar or uncomfortable. For this reason, fear can sometimes lead us to act in ways that actually make us and those around us less safe. For us especially, in a country that's obsessed with guns and the right to defend ourselves, fear can often sadly turn deadly. So there's the fear response that happens when we think we might be in physical danger, but there's also a second kind of fear that relates to our emotional needs. Part of being a human being is needing to be in relationship and community with one another. Having a strong and supportive group of friends or family is essential to our emotional well-being. And we all, at one point or another, have experienced fear of rejection, judgment, and abandonment from a group we've been a part of, whether it was rational or not. I imagine that might have been the kind of fear that Joseph, our humble man of faith, must have been feeling in the story that we just read. Joseph is pledged to be married to Mary, but he learns that she is pregnant before they have consummated the marriage. Joseph wants to be faithful to the law, so he comes up with a pretty reasonable compromise: to back out of the union and to divorce her quietly. What kind of fear is Joseph battling at this moment? Maybe it's fear of being disobedient to his religious teachings. Maybe it's fear of dirty looks and judgments that he might get from other men of faith in his community. I mean, what kind of man is he if he takes someone as his wife who's carrying a baby that's not his? What kind of man is he if he takes a wife who is less pure in their eyes? And on the other hand, Mary finds herself in an incredibly vulnerable position. To be an unmarried mother in this society is extremely dangerous. She could be outcast or even subject to imprisonment or death. It wasn't uncommon for women to be publicly stoned for adulterous behavior. And it seems clear that Joseph didn't wish this fate on Mary. He does not drag her into the town square to be harshly judged by her peers, which he probably could have done. He goes with the nicer middle ground of leaving quietly, hoping that no one will make a big fuss about it if he does. But as is often the case, God has other plans for Joseph. The angel arrives to him in a dream and tells him not to be afraid, to claim Mary and the child that she is bearing. He is to go through with taking Mary as his wife, and she will give birth to a child that will bring salvation for generations to come. Joseph, being the obedient person of faith that he is, does not question the angel, and the rest, as we know, is history. Joseph's decision in this story, his choice to answer God's call, is an act of love. It may not be the warm and fuzzy kind of love that you'd read about in a Nicholas Sparks novel, but it is love nonetheless. When trying to wrap my head around what Joseph's mindset might have been in that moment that the angel came to him, I thought about millions of families like that of Greg and Lynn McDonald. Greg and Lynn, like Joseph, are dedicated people of faith. They were born and raised in a small town right outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Both of them came from humble beginnings and rough childhoods, and they were able to find refuge and solace in a tight-knit faith community that they joined as adults. Like Joseph, they were obedient to the teachings of their religious doctrines. They raised both of their children in the church, they sent them to all the private Christian schools, and they made sure that their kids had the loving and stable community that they never got to have as children. From the outside, you could not have painted a better picture of the quintessential small-town Christian family. But in the early 2000s, they'd have this image rocked when they discovered that their 17-year-old son, Greg Jr., was gay, something that went completely against everything they'd been taught. They panicked and wondered what they might have done wrong. They thought they'd done their best, but every Bible study they'd attended, every book they'd read, told them that their son's identity was unholy and unnatural and a product of a broken home. They blamed themselves and wondered where they went wrong. And they feared how their community might judge them. They would spend the next several years doing everything they could to change who their son naturally was. They tried to pray the gay away. They tried to convince him to go to conversion therapy, which he did not. As an adult, he moved to Chicago, and he eventually had to keep his parents at an arm's length for his own safety as they continually would try to evangelize to him. For more than a decade, they kept their pain and their torment private, only telling select people in their community who they knew they could trust to keep it a secret. They began hiding in their own closet, feeling ashamed and afraid that others would see them as a failure for raising a child who was deviant in the eyes of their religious laws. But everything changed for them about 12 years later when Lynn was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer that required very intense treatments. She became weak and frail, and her hair started falling out in clumps due to the chemo. And who was her biggest supporter and most faithful caretaker through this harrowing ordeal? Her now grown son, Greg Jr., who was a constant at her bedside. He did her laundry, cooked her meals, and helped her bathe. Greg and Lynn began to realize that the son they'd prayed so hard to change for all these years, the child they thought they had failed, was actually an incredibly kind, generous, and loving person, just as they taught him to be. What came next was a long untangling of everything they'd been taught to believe as concrete truth. The McDonald's sought out guidance from LGBTQ+ affirming voices within the Christian community. They read books they had never considered reading before. And they sat down with new friends for coffee, who they know would hear their story without judgment. And after all those years of being debilitated and held back by fear, they decided to come out to their friends and family as faithful Christian parents with an openly gay son whom they loved and accepted just the way he was. When they first found out about their son's sexuality, they felt completely alone in their experience. They'd gone to the pastors of the large church they were attending at the time and begged to be connected with other families who were going through something similar. And out of a church of 5,000 people, there was not one other family willing to admit that they were going through the same situation. Seems unlikely, right? But thankfully, conquering your fears is often a domino effect that affects those around you who are bearing witness and gives them courage as well. The McDonalds started to share their story and eventually started their own organization called Embracing the Journey, which walks alongside other parents of LGBTQ children who are going through the same thing they did. And of course, they were never alone in what they were going through. They'd quickly come to find out there were countless other parents and children in their community going through the exact same struggle, who would eventually end up reaching out to them for advice and guidance. Joseph, like the McDonalds, found himself in a difficult dilemma. Do I stay committed to this person I've promised to love forever? Or do I give in to my fear of being judged and outcast? But if you've had a chance to read Isabella's Advent devotional from the weekend, she beautifully points this out yesterday, that Joseph possesses something very important in this story that Mary does not, which is a choice. Joseph is not the vulnerable person in this story because he gets to choose whether he stays or whether he goes. And when we first encounter Joseph, he has decided to bounce. He has sympathy for Mary, but he's also not trying to get involved in all of that mess. I think it's so interesting that the voice of God throughout the Bible so often appears to people in their dreams. Because I don't know about you all, but for me personally, dreams are where my conscience speaks to me the most loudly. Whatever thing in my life that I think I've successfully avoided has a way of staring me down the moment my eyes close at night. And I wonder what exactly was going on in Joseph's conscience that night when he went to bed. The McDonalds, while they struggled greatly through their ordeal, they recognized that they too were not in as vulnerable of a position as their son was. He'd known much earlier than 17 that he was gay, but he had avoided telling them out of fear that he would be kicked out and cut off financially. It is estimated at least 40% of the nation's adolescent homeless population is LGBTQIA identifying. Likewise, Mary and her baby faced a much greater level of threat than Joseph did. Widows and unwed mothers were amongst the most vulnerable people in their society. Mary and Jesus faced almost certain homelessness and starvation without a father and a husband around. And Joseph would have known this. I wonder if he'd been thinking about what Mary and Jesus' life would look like after he left town the night that the angel of God appeared to him in his dreams. I wonder if he felt guilt, sadness at the thought of the woman he once pledged his love to, alone on the streets with a baby and no food to eat. Sometimes the fear we feel is real, but it's just directed at the wrong threat. Joseph believed his biggest fear was signing on to be a part of a family that would face great social judgment from their religious community. And he'd come up with a solution by choosing to simply walk away and wash his hands of it. But in his dreams that night, God reminded him that the real thing to be feared was much more frightening than what he was choosing to run from. Because you can escape certain situations and circumstances in your life. You can escape and run from relationships. But the one thing you'll never be able to run from is yourself. Walking away from his marriage would have given Joseph an immediate but very short-term relief from what he was feeling. But the deeper, harder to escape fear would have settled in later. He may have realized that fear the first time he saw his reflection and asked himself, am I, an obedient man of faith, really the type of person that can abandon two people whose lives depended on me? Thankfully, God gave him the answer to this question in his dreams that night. God speaks to us in our dreams because that's when our walls have come crashing down, and we no longer have access to the tools we were used to using to make up excuses and to avoid and to take the easy way out. Greg and Lynn spent so many years praying for their son to be changed so that he could rejoin the community that meant so much to them, only to find out it was the community that actually needed changing. Joseph tried to run away to escape the discrimination and the judgment of the world that the world would bring upon his family, only to realize that it was his family being called to change the world. Our sub-theme for this week is when you're afraid, give me your hand. When we're in the midst of our greatest fears, it's such a natural reaction to want to create distance between ourselves and other people. When we're scared, we think we must create a fortress to protect ourselves from all potential danger. But ironically, this is actually the moment when we need each other more than ever. When we're most afraid is when we need to be reminded that we're not alone. It is when we need to be reminded of how loved we are, even when we feel vulnerable and unworthy. Mary was in fear for her life and the life of her child, and she needed to feel the loving touch of Joseph's hand reaching out to her, choosing to intertwine his fate along with hers. Joseph feared he was not prepared to be a husband and a father to this unconventional family, but the angel reminded him not to be afraid. And if he ever felt alone, he could always be reminded through his family and through the eyes of his child that God is always with us, reaching out God's hand at the very moment we think we are completely alone in our fearfulness. When we listen to this story, we might think back to different times in our lives where we were Joseph, the more privileged person with the agency to choose and discern between right and wrong. And in other times, we may have felt more like Mary, vulnerable, and totally at the mercy of the choices of others. In our fourth and final week of Advent, when we reflect upon God's love brought forth to the world in the birth of Jesus, may we be reminded that to love someone is to see their safety and well-being inextricably tied to your own. Your joy is my joy, and your grief is my grief. Love is an action as much as it is a feeling. The feelings come very easily, and the actions often take a lot of risk and sacrifice. Joseph overcomes his fears and fulfilled God's calling for his life. And it was not an easy life that he would lead from this point forward, but I do believe it was meaningful and fulfilling. I doubt we'd be here talking about Joseph today, 2,000 years later, if he had decided to leave and divorce Mary quietly. He helped keep Mary and Jesus safe, and we are all better because of it. His decision helped them bring the ultimate love into the world that comforts us and inspires us still. What kind of love is possible for all of us when, instead of pulling back in fear, we extend our hands out to one another in love as God calls us to? May we ponder this now as we move towards the table.